Hi everyone, today is November 11th, 2021, Veterans Day, and it is also Dostoyevsky's 200th birthday. He was born in 1821 in Moscow, Russia, and he is one of the most important novelists, writers, thinkers, and psychologists in the original sense that has ever lived. The Greek word psychology means study of the soul. Psychos, psyche is the soul, means the soul in ancient Greek. And that is what psychology originally was. It was the study of the human soul, and that is exactly what Dostoyevsky does in every single one of his novels and pieces of written work. And today, in honor of his 200th birthday, I thought we would look at some of his most important ideas and contributions that are still relevant to us today through the lens of two of his most important works. So today we're going to look at, especially at the parable of the Grand Inquisitor. It's a small passage, one of the most famous passages in literature, in his Brothers Karamazov, probably the best novel ever written, and definitely his most famous work. So we're looking at one excerpt, one small, very important excerpt in the Brothers Karamazov, and we'll look at what that tells us about living a life of transcendence and nurturing our immortal souls in a world that values the material and the temporal. So trying to figure out, reflect on what Dostoyevsky tells us about living a life with eternity in mind, to the end of cultivating the fullness of our humanity. As we know, we are mind, body, and spirit, and our world tends to focus on just the body, but we're spirit, we're intellect, we're emotion as well. And so we'll look at the Grand Inquisitor to look at the materialism of our day, and we're going to look at the Crime and Punishment, another one of his very famous novels. And we'll look at what that tells us about virtue being its own reward and vice being its own punishment, and whether we need a concept of the divine, a notion of God, to believe in guilt and to believe in a concept of right or wrong. So let's talk first about the Grand Inquisitor. The Grand Inquisitor is a small passage in Dostoyevsky's epic novel called The Brothers Karamazov. And it is way too long and complicated to go too much into the Brothers Karamazov, so we'll focus just on the parable of the Grand Inquisitor. It is told by Ivan Karamazov, one of the three Karamazov brothers who are the protagonists in this novel. And Ivan is incredibly brilliant. He's smart. He's definitely the smartest character in the novel, and he's an atheist. And he is talking and sharing his parable, a poem he wrote with his brother Alyosha, who's also very thoughtful, a little bit naive, and devout in his faith, his Christian faith, as was Dostoyevsky. Dostoyevsky was a devout Orthodox Christian too. And the parable of the Grand Inquisitor that Ivan Karamazov shares, it encapsulates Ivan and all his brilliance and his intellect, his deepest concerns about the Christian faith, the kind of the intellectual barriers that he faces in not accepting the Christian faith for what it is. And so it starts out where Christ, with Christ's second coming, Christ comes back to Inquisition Spain. This is a period of time of persecution of non-Catholics, of Jews, of Protestants in Spain during the 15th and 16th century. So Christ comes back, and he's quiet, he's demure, he's nondescript, but then he begins healing people, very reminiscent of many of his miracles in the New Testament. He raises a girl from the dead, he makes a blind man see, and even though he's inconspicuous, he doesn't try to draw attention to himself. Of course, the crowds flock to him as soon as he begins engaging these miracles. And then the Grand Inquisitor appears. The Grand Inquisitor, who is leading the Inquisition, he arrives and says, "Guards, seize him." So he has Christ arrested and imprisoned. And once Christ is imprisoned, the Grand Inquisitor visits Christ in the middle of the night and says, "Why have you come back here? Why are you here, Christ? We have just finished fixing all the problems that you left us with last time you were here. Why are you back?" And for the Grand Inquisitor, the problems that Christ left humanity with, was the fact that when Christ was tempted in the desert, when he went into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, he rejected the temptations of the world. Satan tempted him with temporal power, with wealth, with riches, with many different things that were emblematic of the temptations of materialism in this world. And Christ rejected all of them in favor of the eternal, of the hope of salvation, of eternity and heaven, and the Grand Inquisitor said, in holding humanity to that expectation as well, you have asked too much of humanity. The Grand Inquisitor says, give men bread first, meet their material needs first, and then ask them to have virtue and have faith, basically. So it's a really interesting dialogue that the Grand Inquisitor, grills Christ, why are you here? And explains why, all the reasons why he's concerned he's back after the Grand Inquisitor feels like he's fixed all of their problems. And of course, it's ironic since the Inquisition was something that the church did, and the Catholic Church did ostensibly in the name of Christ. And so here is the Grand Inquisitor imprisoning and grilling Christ. Why are you here? Why have you come back? And the Christ is silent the entire time, and he eventually approaches the Grand Inquisitor and gives him a kiss on the cheek, and that's how the parable ends. And it's kind of an ambiguous ending, and on purpose. And Dostoyevsky is telling us, he's causing us to think critically of the way in which many of us today might purport to have either a Christian faith or a set of values, but maybe not live up to them in practice. And at a deeper level, he's critiquing our contemporary materialism, our focus on the needs of the body as opposed to the needs of the spirit, our eternal needs, the needs of our emotion, of our soul. Again, Dostoyevsky is a psychologist in the original sense, examining the needs of the human psyche, the human soul. So that's a really interesting. Reflecting on the Grand Inquisitor poses interesting questions for us today to think about how might we nurture and nourish our souls and the eternal parts of what makes us human. In a world that tends to focus on the material, on the temporal, on the ephemeral, on the things of the flesh and the body. How can we have disciplines and rituals in our lives that nurture another just as human part of who we are, the eternal part of who we are as human beings? So that's a really lovely thought from Dostoyevsky. Secondly, let's consider Crime and Punishment, and again another novel Dostoyevsky wrote that helps us think deeply about the way in which virtue is its own reward and vice its own punishment, and whether we need a concept of God to have a concept of good and evil and a concept of right or wrong and morality at all. The protagonist of Crime and Punishment is Raskolnikov. He is a law student in St. Petersburg, Russia, and he is very smart but incredibly poor, and kind of even gone a little bit insane on the brink of starvation. He works really hard but can't provide for his basic needs. And so he has this idea to rob a pawnbroker, someone who is almost universally detested and who's cruel and mean and takes advantage of people in need. And it's a woman in his community who he himself has pawned the last of his possessions to. And he begins to decide that he's going to murder her, he's going to rob her, and that will solve all his problems, he thinks. So, and in addition to being just cruel and unkind and taking advantage of needy members of their community, the pawnbroker also has a half-sister who's mentally challenged and who she beats. She treats as a slave and is both verbally abusive and physically abusive to her. So as Raskolnikov is thinking about committing this murder, he begins to rationalize it. He looks to, he conjures up all these different reasons for why it's a good thing. First of all, he says, I'll be able to provide for myself. Once I'm able to take her money, I'll be able to meet my basic needs, and then I'll be able to do good things in the world, he says. And he also says, maybe people even think I'm a hero for ridding the world of this horrible person who takes advantage of people, and especially the poor and the marginalized and even the mentally handicapped, such as this woman's half-sister. So he goes through all these rationalizations, and he comes up with this kind of greatest good for the greatest number rationalization for committing this murder that Dostoyevsky is intentionally responding to a growing contingent of his intellectuals of his day that are embracing utilitarianism, that are saying, let's sacrifice one for the greater good of all. And so Dostoyevsky is very intentionally responding to that here. So Raskolnikov eventually does commit the murder, but unfortunately, the half-sister walks in on the murder, so he kills her too, the mentally handicapped woman. And he robs her, and he immediately hides the money. And very quickly, even though he seems to have gotten away with the murder, he quickly unravels psychologically. He goes absolutely insane. And there is, interestingly enough, there's an inspector in the novel who kind of witnesses Raskolnikov's psychological deterioration. And in his mind, that's evidence of Raskolnikov's guilt, even though there's no physical evidence, nothing that they really have that ties him to the crime, that can convict him. And slowly throughout the novel, he's kind of like a tertiary kind of background character, the inspector, but he pokes and prods at Raskolnikov's, sophisticated and hardened exoskeleton and convicts him internally. And that only corroborates and furthers the work of Raskolnikov's own conscience, which is convicting him more and more all the time. He goes more and more insane and just deteriorates rapidly. As the novel goes on, as he struggles to live with himself after committing this horrible crime. And there's a lot more to it. All of Dostoyevsky's novels are incredibly complex and sophisticated with many, many characters. But at the end of the novel, Raskolnikov eventually realizes that he cannot live with himself. He cannot live life with knowing that he's committed this murder, and he deeply desires penance. He desires to be punished. That's the only way that he thinks that he can live. And so he ultimately turns himself in and confesses to the crime of his murders and the robbery. And he is sentenced to exile in Siberia for several years. And that's a fate that he embraces, because he said he needed to be punished to feel like he could be okay and continue to live his life. And so it's really interesting that even though he maybe could have gotten away with the crime, he couldn't live with himself. And one interesting idea I come across in talking with different readers and friends about this wonderful novel, Crime and Punishment, is what if the inspector didn't really exist? Often throughout the novel, there are certain things that the inspector says to Raskolnikov and observes that he couldn't possibly know for certain. So what if he didn't exist and he was really just a manifestation of Raskolnikov's guilt, his psychological guilt and deterioration, and that is probing and pricking his conscience and convicting him kind of throughout the novel, and ultimately bringing him to the point of confessing and turning himself in for his crime. So I think that's a really interesting theory, and regardless of whether you accept that or not, we don't know what Dostoyevsky would have said to such an idea about his writing. What we do know, though, is that what Dostoyevsky is saying is that we don't need to believe in God or have a concept of the divine and eternal laws to be subject to the divine law and eternal law or natural law. That our sins will find us out, and the things that we do will find us out. Our own, even if we can convince the world that we are okay and that we're perfect, we're morally upright human beings, we ultimately, at the end of the day, cannot hide from our own souls. and that our sins will find us out, and that in the same way that virtue is its own reward, as people such as Socrates and Confucius said before Dostoyevsky, vice is its own punishment, and the guilty conscience is its own punishment. And this is what Dostoyevsky powerfully depicts in Crime and Punishment. So I love both of these works. The Brothers Karamazov, greatest novel of all time, I absolutely commend it to you. And again, the Grand Inquisitor that we talked about is a small section within this massive, beautiful novel. And Crime and Punishment as well. I commend both of them to you. And I hope that you have enjoyed learning a little bit about Dostoyevsky and about his work and ideas, and how they're still relevant to us today, 200 years after his birth. And I hope that it intrigues you to pick up one of these great works and reflect on some of the highest questions in life. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to lead life well, with integrity, with meaning? These are some of the ideas that we love to talk about at Civic Renaissance, especially on a rainy day like today here in Indianapolis. Perfect day to sit by the fire and to reflect on one of the greatest psychologists and writers and creators in human history. So happy birthday, Dostoyevsky.